Let me paint a picture for you as we get started here. You're out on a solo backpacking trip in the winter. You've just hiked around 6 miles through much deeper snow than you expected to be hiking in. You're in a desert canyon and the sun has dropped behind the canyon walls, and crossing the ice-covered creek proves to be way more challenging than you expected it to be. And the sandstone slick rock provides little to no traction for hiking. You know you're prepared with the right gear, but things start to not go quite as you planned or hoped they would go when you were ultimately planning the trip. Now a cloud system has moved in on your campsite and the temperatures drop into the low 20s. Anxiety, doubt, and maybe even a little bit of fear gets into your head. And you've now got some decisions to make for the next 2 days of your trip. What do you do when you find yourself in a situation you didn't plan for? How do you make decisions on what to do? And what is risk management? What does it even mean to make smart decisions in the backcountry? These are honest and important questions to be asking long before you ever find yourself with your pack on and on the trail. These questions are the types of things to be asking yourself as you begin to plan your route and overall backpacking trip. Hey everybody, welcome to the Backpacking Experience podcast. I have got an awesome discussion to share with you today, and this episode is way longer form than much of the other episodes, but this is such an important conversation that I want to share because I ultimately went through this decision-making process on my most recent backpacking trip to Capitol Reef National Park. So we're going to kind of relive this scenario, this picture that I've just painted for you, and you heard me talking in the opening clip about some of this decision-making that I made. But it's important for me to paint this picture and just kind of create some kind of understanding of where we're headed with this conversation. I've also got a friend that is joining me to help develop this conversation about making smart decisions in the backcountry, and he's going to be the vast majority of this episode is a discussion and an interview with him. And so we've got some stories to share that are going to help illustrate and educate the points that we want to present in today's episode. So grab something to drink, go for a long drive, or whatever it is, because it's going to be a good conversation. So I want to go back to the first of the episode and develop this story a little bit more of this recent backpacking trip that I went on in Capitol Reef National Park. I'm going to share some sound clips of me talking to the camera as I'm out on this trip because I think it will give you a little bit more background on just kind of what I was experiencing. And I do have a video of this trip that you can see in video form that is going to be titled When Things Don't Go As Planned. So I've got that video linked in the show notes as well. But if you want to follow along after this episode and see more of how that process went down for me personally, I invite you to go and check out that video that's on my YouTube channel. So back to this trip about Capitol Reef National Park. I had been planning to get out on a solo backpacking trip for several weeks and had decided to head to a location in Capitol Reef that I had hiked back in the fall of 2018. The plan was to do the route the opposite direction as I had done in 2018. And before going, I knew there was some snow in the area, but wasn't totally certain on the exact amount. And even when I called down to the ranger station, the visitor center, they weren't able to give me exact amounts in all of the areas that I was going to be because nobody had been there to do any snow measurement. So that one aspect wasn't enough for me to change my mind when planning this trip. I had microspikes in my pack for possible ice and to help manage the sandstone, a mesa that I would be going up on the second day. But also checking the weather, I was looking at sunny skies and cold temperatures. But it was nothing that wasn't something that I could manage or that I had had previous experience with before. As I got to the trailhead and started making my way down into the canyon, I was presented with about 6 to 8 inches of snow and a lot of ice. So, okay, this is manageable and really not that bad, is what I kept thinking to myself. I can do this. This is what I planned for. This is kind of what I expected, but yes, there's a little bit more snow than I had anticipated. The snow-covered desert canyon walls were absolutely beautiful, and I was having, honestly, just a time of my life. It was cool to see amazing petroglyphs in some of these areas of the canyon that really brought back some like perspective of maybe how the people down there lived in these kind of conditions. But then something changed. The sun started to go down behind the cliffs, and it started to get colder. This really wasn't a big deal, like I mentioned before. I was prepared for this, but the further I got into the canyon, the more the conditions started to take a toll on me mentally. I'd made an effort to get around a bend in the creek by scrambling up a small slick rock ledge, and in warmer weather, this would be a piece of cake, and I wouldn't even think twice about it, honestly. But I stepped my foot onto the rock, and I put my weight on my foot to then just have it totally slip under the snow, and I bashed my knee into the rock. And that single foot slip would become a critical decision maker for what would take place later into the trip, and we'll get into this. But let me take you to that exact moment and some of the moments after. I've got running water, which is really nice, but it's already proving a little bit difficult to navigate because I've got ice and I just cannot afford to get wet. Because if I get wet, that's bad news bears. So I gotta be really careful with this stream. Well, I got a few things going through my head right now, and it all has to do with managing the snow levels that I've got right now. There's way more snow down here than I anticipated. Got like 6 to 8 inches of snow. So my hope is that where I was planning to camp, I can get somewhere higher up onto a bench so that maybe there's less snow on the north side of the canyon. And then I'd be able to gather water. I'd be able to have the sun earlier in the morning. Those are all things that I'm trying to figure out right now with being out here. And if I get up higher, then I'm likely to be sleeping warmer as well. So down in the canyon where most of this stream is totally like iced over, it's gonna be a cold night. So just trying to make some decisions in my head right now. It's nice to be out. It's quiet, peaceful, and I'm really enjoying myself. As I mentioned in this, the conditions were different than I had planned for, and I had to be smart about what I was doing. I was solo, and I was in conditions that were just different enough from what I anticipated that I needed to be smart. So let's fast forward to me exiting the canyon that I had been hiking through, and where I ultimately made some critical decisions on what to do. I'm making a decision that I don't want to make. And that is that I just do not, given the conditions that I'm in right now, I don't feel comfortable going with the original route that I had planned. I know, having gone through that route before, that there are just really steep slick rock ledges and there's potential for a lot of ice. I've got my micro spikes, but even with that, I'm very nervous to go do that route solo because I'm in a very, very remote place. And if I get hurt, it's going to be very difficult for somebody to come get me. Because I'm solo, given the conditions, it was supposed to be a bright, sunny, beautiful day today, according to the weather. And some kind of storm has moved in. It's even starting to snow a little bit. I know I'm talking a lot, but I think it's important for me to share my thought processes and what I'm going through in my head on a solo trip like this, especially in the winter, because you have to be extra careful and very smart in your risk management decisions. I just cannot risk getting hurt being by myself in a very remote location. So I have the ability to bypass this section of the route that I want to do to go north up to another canyon that takes me directly to my car. This is not an easy decision. And that's why I'm sharing it, because I'm not calling this a fail. I'm calling this smart risk management decision making, because I just cannot risk the exposure, the elements and things up there. There's very little visibility above me, and I've got some very steep slick rock faces as well as some exposure and cliff faces that, if I'm not careful, could be very dangerous, and it's just not worth it. If I had somebody else with me, we may just say, hey, let's go check it out and see what it's like. But given, again, the conditions, I have to be smart. I have to make good decisions. So we're going to bypass it. We're going to just walk north and kind of take an easy stroll through a beautiful section of the area. Just absolutely beautiful. And it's cool to be here in the winter. So I feel good about it. And the fact that I feel good about it means that it's the right decision. And it makes me sad to not be going up there. It really does, because it's incredible, but just gonna have to save it for another day. So let's get on walking in the other direction. I think it's important to share at this point, having heard some of that decision-making process and what was going through my head being out there, it can be difficult to kind of comprehend, well, dude, it probably really wasn't that bad. And ultimately, I'll never know if I had stuck with that original route, that it would have been fine and the concerns that I had really not been an issue to begin with. I don't know that. However, this is the important thing about making decisions in the backcountry. You don't get to play the what if game. You get to play the do the right and logical thing based on your knowledge and experience from time spent in the field. So the question now is, what is the point of this story and how does it illustrate backcountry risk management? Well, let's talk about it. And I want to bring into the conversation my friend Christian Paul. Christian is honestly just a rad dude. And he and I met through a local hiking Facebook group and have exchanged route ideas. We've just chatted back and forth about different plans. We even potentially had like a trip planned together into an area that's around Capitol Reef. But we've enjoyed discussing our local trails, and he also lives here in Utah. So to give you a little bit of background real quick on Christian, he's going to talk about this a little bit as well, but he's got an impressive resume in the outdoor industry. He's a professional photographer that focuses on landscape photography and has had images featured and published in like Backpacker magazine, other national press. He's also a former Backcountry.com alumni and created a really cool gear guru department in the company and managed that until 2008. So outside of all that, he's just got years and years of experience in the backcountry, going backpacking, fly fishing, splitboarding, his photography, camping, hiking, you name it. The guy has some solid experience. And what you're about to hear in this conversation that he and I have is some really cool, good takeaways. And so I invite you to really pay attention to what comes out of this conversation with Christian. Well, everybody, I've got Christian Paul here on the podcast. Christian, how you doing today, man?
Good, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, super excited to have you here. We literally just spent like an hour on the phone with each other before jumping into this podcast, and I know that we're going to have a really good conversation about risk management, and I'm stoked to see your perspective on this. And I know that we're going to get into an experience that you had this last backpacking season in the fall, and we'll talk about that. But the first thing that I want to do is, why don't you give myself as well as just all the listeners some background on yourself so that there's some understanding of your backcountry experience as we're talking about risk management and how, like, more or less some credibility to what we're talking about. That makes sense?
Absolutely. I've been a backpacker for 20 years now. I've traveled the backcountry from Alaska to the Pacific Northwest, the Rockies, the Red Rock Deserts of Utah and Arizona, and the High Uintas Wilderness and Wasatch here in Utah, which are my local ranges. I have an associate's degree in photography from Salt Lake Community College. I completed my Red Cross certification in 2002, and I have my AVI 1 certification, which I completed in 2006.
What kind of backpacking trips are you going on? What primarily are you doing when you go out into the backcountry?
Well, I'm a photographer. I own my own business, Christian Paul Photography, and My specialty is landscape and astrophotography, fine art, landscape and astrophotography. And I sell fine art prints. I work with 28 magazines being on their ad lists where I pick up projects that they're looking for. And so that generates some of my trips because you want to go out and get the photography that they'll print. I've been in Backpacker magazine as along with a bunch of local and national press. And so photography is the biggest thing about, backpacking for me. That's where I'm going and why I'm going out there is to shoot photography. So that pretty much inspires most of what I do.
In terms of risk management, because prior to you joining the episode here, I shared an experience that I had on just like my most recent backpacking trip of how I went through like some decision making that ultimately resulted in not following through with my original plan. And I haven't given a lot of explanation, I should say, that is, okay, here's the experience that I had. And now let's talk about risk management and what is risk management. So that's my question. From your perspective, how would you define risk management?
Well, I define risk management as understanding, the environment that you're going into, the variables that could come up, and what you're prepared for. I pretty much look at risk management as the first thing you want to do is develop a personal risk profile, or a PRP. And we can put risk into 3 categories. It's low risk, medium risk, and high risk. We all have to be honest with ourselves and evaluate our skill level versus the level of risk we are willing to expose ourselves to. I encourage everybody to ask themselves, what is your personal risk profile? Are you a low, medium, or high risk person? For example, if you're a low risk individual, meaning the least amount of risk that you're willing to expose yourself to, and you're engaging in a high risk activity, are you really prepared for if it all goes wrong? Wilderness areas are inherently dangerous. There are no guarantees when we are out there. So our only option is to mitigate and manage risk. The good part of all of that is it's easy to plan for an adventure when you have this all lined up in your mind before you hit the trail.
It's funny that you bring that aspect up because in a way, I would almost think that from like an outsider perspective, or somebody that may be new to backcountry travel, whatever method that is, mountain bike or backpacking or backcountry skiing, whatever it is, like, couldn't that be viewed as like fear mongering almost of, well, you have to do all of these things to be able to go have a good experience in the backcountry. If like, you see what I'm saying?
I think it's just a matter of perspective. I think some people let their egos get in the way when they go out there. And from my experience and the accidents that I've seen and that I've been a part of and the rescues that I've participated in, it's usually someone that has either not calculated a risk or gone unprepared, and they don't actually know what their risk profile is. And it's interesting when I have conversations with other backpackers, I'll bring this subject up, and they always tell me, every single one's always, that is a really good way to look at it, because I've never evaluated my risk profile or what I'm willing to accept risk wise versus what I'm prepared to face if it does go all wrong. And so it's just something that's definitely benefited me, especially with all the solo backpacking that I do. And, come out unscathed. And I think some of it's partly luck, but I think some of it's partly managing myself with this in my head and just understanding who I am, what my skill level is, and what I'm willing to expose myself to. No matter whether you're low risk or high risk, wilderness is a dangerous place to go. It is.
It absolutely is.
And I think that we have to understand, the dangers that are involved with that. There's a guy that's a Utah avalanche forecaster. His name's Drew Hardesty, and he wrote a essay on the Black Diamond website about risk and about that. It's funny. It irritated and ruffled quite a few feathers of people that read that, because he was pointing out that if we travel in the wilderness, because the wilderness is inherently dangerous, we are inherently dangerous. And that's why it's really good for us to, develop this profile in our head, so that way we can manage ourselves a little bit better. And it definitely puts the blockade up of pushing ourselves into activities that we're either not physically prepared to engage in. They're in over our head. The terrain is much more difficult than we thought we were going to get into. And that's where a lot of people can find themselves in trouble, because they just don't see the red flags of what's going wrong.
Well, I want to unpack this risk profile that you're referring to. What does that profile consist of? How does that get defined? And how do you ultimately come to a conclusion of what your personal risk profile is?
So, you got to ask yourself honestly, like, can I do a 10-mile hike? Can I, do that 512 trad climb that I want to do in, Joshua Tree? Can I, do I have the paddling experience, to tackle the Colorado in a kayak? I mean, any outdoor activity that you're going to participate in, you have to ask yourself, what's your skill level? And that defines your risk level right there. And then you can apply it to, is this activity over my head? Am I getting in over my head? And that will eliminate, at least 1/3 of the dangerous possibilities that are going to pop up in a trip right away, because you're being honest with yourself. And I think that's the one thing that a lot of people don't do is, there's a lot of our society, functions off of a lot of, the opinions of others and what we share on social media. And so we always want to look like, we're like the most adventurous person, or we do the most adventurous thing. But a lot of people aren't honest with themselves about, where they would place themselves in the risk profile. And some people say, oh, I'm high risk, but they're not prepared for high risk at all. And then high risk happens and they find themselves in a life-threatening situation. And then they're thinking after the accident, oh my goodness, I wish I would have looked at my risk profile because I got in over my head. And, those people that recognize that before trouble begins, that's just going to benefit them. And it's worked for me for 20 years in the wilderness and the travels that I've gone on, that I have operated with this mindset. And it has been absolutely beneficial to my adventures and my travels. And like I told you this earlier, I have this saying, don't become 6 o'clock news. I'm thinking that every time I go. And
Right.
part of that is this risk profile that helps prevent that. So, and I've seen some doozies of injuries from other people in the wilderness that I've come upon hiking out on trails, or I've been backcountry touring and someone's dislocated a shoulder, or they busted their femur. Or, I had a guy, I was backcountry touring Alta after they had closed one spring, and I was up on the Baldy shoulder, and I had dropped in and done my line, and I got to the bottom of the bowl and was about to descend. And I was just looking back up at my line because, we typically do that when we're split boarding. He's like, wow, that was a really cool run I just did. And all of a sudden, this plume of snow comes over one of the shoulders off this cliff, and I could see a guy in the plume, and he gets ragdolled down the hill, straight scorpions when he stops, and he goes to stand up, and you could tell his body's messed up. Like half of his upper body is like dragging towards his knees, and the other half looks like it's being supported by his spine. And I go up there, and his collarbone's sticking through his shirt, and so I ended up, he was strong enough to stand on his legs. So he only could get on one ski because there was something wrong with his leg too. And the medical personnel at the bottom of the ski resort, when I got down with him, addressed all of those concerns. But I was able to get him on one ski, and I carried his other ski and poles out along with my gear, and we rode to the base together. And then the sheriff, the marshal, that town marshal there at Alta was there to meet us. And he had radioed medical personnel, and they rolled up in an ambulance and took it from there. So, but yeah, no, I've seen, the worst. And that person probably just was, a sunny day. You get lost in the mindset that, there's no problem here. Sunny day, having a great time. And you forget the dangers because it goes to the back of your mind because everything else is present. And then it all goes wrong. And you leave yourself standing there going, what just happened? And seeing that guy come tumbling over that cliff. I mean, he got tossed off like a 50-foot cliff, man, because he had triggered an avalanche on the shoulder. And
that's crazy.
The avalanche, when it flushed him over the shoulder into the main bowl of the ballroom, is what they call it at Alta. And I think he's just lucky I was standing there, because most everybody I had seen up there had already descended and gone home. Ski resorts closed. There's no active ski patrol on. We regularly tour ski resort terrain once it closes if it's allowed, because it's safe terrain. It's been skied all season. There's no deep instabilities or, persistent weak layers to deal with. You're just dealing with storm snow, which is manageable.
The next question that I have for you, though, is because, with that story, when you're talking about risk management, you've got kind of like two aspects. You've got known risks and inherent risks that you know, okay, if I'm going to go backcountry skiing, I obviously know that I have the potential of getting caught in an avalanche. That's something that is the potential to happen. I go backpacking and I have stream crossings, and it's possible that I could fall into that stream. Weather could turn, it could get cold, hypothermia could become like a real thing. Those are those like known potential risks that you can more or less plan for. But then you've got the other side of the spectrum, or the other thing that I was talking about, that are just straight up accidents, right?
Yeah.
And so we'll talk about accidents because you've got a story to share that I really want to hear about. But I want to talk about these inherent risks that are known beforehand, and these potential risks. Like, what is the planning process like for you as you're planning for a backcountry ski tour or a backpacking trip or a day hike? What questions are you asking yourself at home before you ever step foot out of your car onto the trail to make sure that you're able to not become 6 o'clock news, as you said, and be able to come home and then plan another awesome adventure?
Absolutely. No, and that's a great subject and question to bring up, because I don't know if a lot of people do this. And, I think just from my travels that the set of the way that I look at things before I go was probably instigated a lot by my avalanche education. The very first thing I do before even packing for a trip is get the most up-to-date weather forecast. Doesn't matter if it's backpacking or split boarding. For backcountry travel in the winter, getting the avalanche forecast is mandatory. And weather plays a huge role in that, making good decisions to avoid avalanches. Weather can be one of the most dangerous things you can face out there, and a change in the weather that is drastic can kill you if you're not prepared. There are great tools on the National Weather Service website that I use, which you can give you an hourly forecast up to 7 days out. That way you know when thunderstorms are expected and know when not to be in certain areas like peaks, ridge tops, open meadows near isolated trees. And this also allows you to plan your day on trail and what it's going to be like. Are you going to be wearing a rain jacket all day long? Are the mosquitoes going to be swarming so bad you're breathing them? Just knowing the weather is like the very first thing that you should do before you even pack a backpack, because you don't even know what gear you're going to need unless you're familiar with, the weather you're expecting in the area that you're visiting.
Right, because that weather forecast is going to dictate in so many ways what gear you leave behind and the gear that you switch out, that maybe the normal stuff that you take, and now I need to take something different for this trip.
Absolutely. And you mentioned stream crossing. So if, you've got weather that's, the forecasted to go sub-freezing, and, you might rethink that river crossing. If you're planning, you cross that river, then you got to get to camp at night, and you're soaking wet and it's going to be below freezing all night long. You might find another way around, or I'll down log to cross or something else to not have to get in that water, because hypothermia will kill you just as fast as anything out there. And so, thinking about those things, and if you have a good river crossing, then you're going to go prepared with gear so you can do that and come out without having to face hypothermia. And just planning for things like that is really important. You put that personal risk profile together, and then you understand the weather you're going to get into and the terrain you're going to face. Those things are all crucial and essential before you even put the keys in the ignition to leave the driveway. It's more important than, and I have this rule of thumb with gear I go by called the Big Five. And the Big Five will always keep you alive in a survival situation: shelter, sleep, fire, water, food. And those are always, main components of what I pack in my bag. But I don't even touch any of that till I get that weather forecast first. That's the very first thing that I look at, is weather forecast. And the weather's going to dictate, am I going to push a mountain pass today? And I see there's an 80% chance of thunderstorms, and, they've rated the lightning probability to a 4, because usually in the lightning scale, they go to 0 to 5. And they're saying it's going to be a 4. No, that pass trip's probably off the docket. I'm going to find something. It's going to be in an even stand of trees, more low-lying terrain. And it just shows you how weather can make you dictate your terrain choice just by the conditions you're going to face when you go out there. Yeah. Weather's not an exact science. It does change. It fluctuates, and you could see something that says 20% chance of thunderstorms. I've been out in the UNS when this has happened. I went to Alsop 2 years ago. And we had got in the first day. It was 20% chance of thunderstorms, and it's supposed to be clear the rest of the weekend. We walked in and got up to the switchbacks and over the waterfall, and into the main meadows heading into the lake. And I mean, just raging thunderstorms came in. I mean, ground shaking thunder, lightning bolts getting thrown. It was just crazy. And we got into camp. It broke for a minute. So we're like, okay, that was probably just the rumbler, late afternoon rumbler. Those are normal in the Uintas. And as soon as we finished dinner, it was about 10 o'clock at night. Both of us just had to dive into our tents because in it came and it rumbled all night long, throwing lightning, thunder, heavy rainfall. Definitely tested the waterproofing on my tent that night. That was insane. I haven't been in a rainstorm like that since Oregon. That was insane. And you're up there isolated, and you're one of the highest points. So you're just praying the lightning decides not to tickle where you're laying. So and that's just that just goes to show you that you can gauge all of this stuff right, but it can still all go wrong. But there are ways that we can prepare ourselves mentally, where we don't put ourselves in situations for when it does go all wrong, we're in over our heads. So,
yeah. And that's basically more or less the thought process that took place this last weekend on the trip that I was at in Capitol Reef with the weather report. I mean, I pulled a weather report right before I left. When I had service, I checked all of the weather report to make sure, okay, everything's the same as when I left the house 5 hours ago. And then the night, or the first night that I'm on the trail, I pull out my satellite device, pull the weather report, and it still gave the same information. But for some reason, the particular area that I was, whether it was a cold sink or some kind of variable that changed the way that the weather pattern worked in that particular area, was not what I had planned for. And it ultimately was a checkbox point for me making a decision to change what I was doing. And so, yeah, I mean, being able to prepare for those things ahead of time and being able to know how to make decisions when those things are presented to you.
Absolutely. No. And yeah, you told me your story, and I think you made all the right decisions. I always believe in there's no shame in turning back, and go conquer it another day. Some days the wilderness is saying, hey, come play. And some days the wilderness is saying, get the hell out of here. It's really up to you to recognize all of that. And, you should feel fortunate that you do have some sort of a process that you follow when you go out there, because it made you make healthy and good decisions. And that's why we're sitting here talking today, because you made the right one. So,
right. Now, moving on to just kind of moving through this process, you've made a plan, you've identified those inherent risks, the known potential risks by checking weather reports, you've checked the map routes, and those maps are giving you some information, so you've planned for those aspects. But now that you're out on the trail, what if things don't go to plan? How do you decide on contingency plans? How do you make decisions that keep you safe?
Well, that's going to dictate the situation that you're in. So if it's a weather issue, then you've got to, I have a barometer on my Sunto watch that I wear, so I can watch if the barometer starts falling. I know I've got big storms coming. If it's an injury issue, then you have to assess the situation, assess the patient. Is the patient mobile? Can the patient be evac'd without emergency help? There's a lot of variables that go into that. I mean, even just campsite selection and, safe water and, especially traveling in southern Utah, this, that, you could be in a drainage that, you want to collect water from, and you could have some dead animal 20 miles up the stream and you have no idea you're drinking water that's been polluted with an infected animal. I mean, it's all about, taking the situation at the time and then evaluating it and, assessing, do I have, what I need to make it through this? And that's just basic survival. And I just, that's just kind of the process I go through when I approach every single situation, from an injury to someone that's in pain, that someone's having, digestive tract issues when they're in a group and you're out backpacking. Maybe someone, had the flu or something when they came, and all of a sudden you're 10 miles from the car and they're burning 103 fever. I mean, it's just being able to manage what you can handle, but also, don't be afraid to ask for help when you feel like you're in over your head, because you're only hurting the person you're with if you pretend that you can handle a situation that you can't. And I'll get
Sure.
into that in the story in a minute when we talk about the accident and why I made the decisions that I did and the outcome that we got from making those decisions. So
The next question I have for you, because I know how I execute contingency plans,
Mhm.
but I'm curious to know basically on every backpacking trip, whether or not you've planned for having a contingency plan, you have one that's like inherently just there because if things don't go the way they are supposed to, then you're just going to hike out. Like that's your contingency plan. But what if you don't really have all of a simple option like that? How do you personally execute a contingency plan if you're out solo, which brings a lot of other variables and things to consider, but even just out with one other individual?
The general rule, make sure you leave where you're going with two people. You always hear this: leave a note, let people know where you're going. Let them know when you're going to come home. I take it one step further because what if the person you give your information to is in an auto accident? You're in the middle of the woods. You need rescue. They're not there because they're dead, and they can't call search and rescue to get you out. So I always make it a rule to leave that information with two people, and that's super, super critically important for, because what that does for you. So say like you did get injured, say like I'm out solo backpacking, walking through a wilderness area. Oh, that's a really cool tree. I missed like a hole in the trail, or a rock flips me on my leg. I bust my fib tib. So now I'm laying 10 miles from the car. I'm hurt. Maybe I say I don't have a PLB, a personal locator beacon with me. You're initially going to panic. You're going to freak out about that. But if you do leave where you're going, when you're going to be home with two people, and if you have the managing agency for search and rescue in that area and you've left that number with them too, what it does for you, because survival is like 90% mental. And so if you're in that situation and you're stuck, there's going to be a point where you're going to become overdue with the people that you left this information with. And search and rescue is going to be coming for you because you've left that information so they can come find you.
Right.
It helps with the mental facet of things, of being able to stay strong until rescue gets to you. Because a lot of people will give up, and that doesn't help anything. And then, you have the tragic outcomes that we've all seen and heard about. It helps you hold on and just hunker down, do the best that you can with the situation you're in, and just stay put. Like they always tell you, don't wander off, stay put. If you're in an area that people know you're in, don't leave the area, because if you have search and rescue come through and you're not there, that doesn't do them any good. So,
Right.
those are really important things to take into consideration. Is it's just that a simple, I always leave it with my wife, and then I leave an email with my mom. And so say something happened to my wife, God forbid, my mom will, if she hasn't heard from me by a certain time, is going to call search and rescue, and they're going to initiate rescue to my location. And if I can, I'll leave GPS coordinates. Sometimes it's just a trailhead or an area you're going into, or a certain lake you're going to camp at. If I can leave GPS coordinates, though, the faster you can get them in there and get to your aid, the better off you're going to do in survival and recovery. So,
yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, then my next question for you is, how does, for you going solo into the backcountry, change your decision-making versus when you're out with a group?
Oh, but drastically. When I'm solo, I have a start to finish itinerary. I don't think most people are this disciplined in their daily lives with how I operate out there it's literally I know what time I'm leaving from the trailhead to go in. I have a pretty good idea of the mileage I'm going to be doing to where I'm going. I don't deviate. I don't off trail. I don't do anything. I stay on that main shot. When I get to camp, I tend to stick in camp. I'll walk around a lake if I'm there and, do a little area exploring, but I'm not climbing any peaks that are, anything is anything of a scramble, or putting myself in dangerous terrain, or crossing massive boulder fields or anything like that. I dial back my activity on the solo trips because there's that variable that you don't have someone that can go for help. You're there by yourself. And so if you get injured, you're on your own. I'll give you a little story about a place that I always go and visit, which we talked about a little earlier on that, but we'll stick with this subject. I've been going there for 10 years. I know the place like the back of my hand. I mean, I probably know it better than my own house. I just know all the areas and places you can camp and hike in there and stuff like that. And I have stepped on this same rock crossing this little inlet for 10 years straight. Okay. Rock solid, never had a problem. Well, 2 years ago, I was in there solo and I went to step on that rock when I was crossing the inlet. Well, we had such a moist year that year, that rock literally sunk in the mud like it was quicksand. And I've got my really expensive DSLR in one hand and my fishing rod in the other hand. And all I'm thinking is protect my camera, right? And so, what's the first thing they always teach you in snowboarding about falling is fall to your back. It's one of the strongest things you can fall on because it'll resist break. If you go straight to your hands, you can break your wrists. Your legs can break. It's always just cross your arms. So I just put the camera to my chest and went to my back. Well, it kind of went to my back, but to my left side. And I didn't see this, but in the grass sticking up at the shore, there's one of those like pony rocks. You've seen them out there in the Uintas where some of them will look like shark's teeth sticking out of the ground. Yeah. And I didn't see it. And my left quad went straight into it. All I can say is if you could take a sledgehammer and smash it into your quad, this is what it felt like. And when I initially fell, the pain was so bad, I thought I had a broken femur. And I sat there for a minute. Of course, the panic kind of starts to come over your head because you're a little freaked out. But then, I don't know what it is. I just have this instinctual thing that when there's a traumatic situation, I just go into this like work mode. And my brain's thinking, okay, you need to reduce swelling. You need to reduce pain. You need to elevate. And so I got up and tested out. I could walk on it. It was sore. Looking at it, I had one of those big purple hematomas on the side of my leg, which was just absolutely horrid. And it hurt to even touch. And, it was kind of a colder time of year when I was in there this year. And I took some rocks in camp that were ice cold. And I was using them as the cold compress on the injury and took some ibuprofen. I carry some Ibu 800s with me. So I did that because I figured it would help with the swelling. And I just kind of got in my camp chair and put my leg up on this rock in camp. And it just kept it elevated for a few hours. And after about 4 or 5 hours, it was sore, but I was manageable. I felt like I could walk out of there. When it initially happened, I'm like, oh, great, I'm in here all by myself. And there's a mountain pass between me and the car. And how am I going to get out with a broken leg? But and so, I woke up the next morning and it was even a little bit stronger than that. So I was able to hike out and I had a pretty nasty bruise for almost a year. It literally didn't go away till like midsummer this past summer we just went through. And, but that was one of those things when you're solo, that, it just goes to show you that anything can happen. And you've got to be able to manage for that. And, luckily I had left that itinerary with both people. That was always in the back of my mind. And that gave me a little bit of comfort to just focus on, okay, just treat the situation, man, because if you're overdue, rescue's coming. And so it allowed me to kind of focus on, okay, I need to triage the injury. I need, pain relief. I need to get water in me because you dehydrate faster at high elevations, especially when you're hurt. Heart rate levels up. There's just all sorts of things medically that you've got to check off so you're okay. And by that time that night, I was still a little sore, was still using the rocks as a cold compress, but I had a nice fire, got to enjoy my camp, had dinner, got my sleeping bag, woke up with, a 50% reduction in pain that I had the night before. And I credit, just sticking to that mentality of, make sure that you're prepared before you go, like we had talked previously, and then just knowing, what you could take care of and what you're in over your head with. And you'll hear more about the in over your head thing when we talk about the accident in a minute. Yeah. So, why, you make decisions that, if I had a broken femur, I probably would have set it and then just set myself up in my tent and just waited for rescue. Because that's really your only option solo at that point. But it does, solo backpacking is one of those things that I really think it takes a certain individual to do. I don't think it's for everybody. And I think you have to be prepared for it to all go bad and be alone when it does. So
there's all those aspects about being out there solo. And that's crazy that
And I mean, anything can happen.
True.
You never had an issue with that rock before, and then all of a sudden, boom, here you go, and now you're in a situation that you didn't plan on having your quad having that that big bruise and that injury to manage.
Oh man.
And as far as like the group setting is concerned, I find that when I'm out with a group, it especially with friends, because I go out as a like trip leader, expedition leader, and an instructor with groups, and that mentality is far different in decision making as the person that's responsible for the safety, the well-being, and just the overall experience of these individuals that I'm guiding, more or less, versus when I go out with a group of friends, and that you find yourself in a lot of ways making decisions, or the lack thereof, not even making decisions, that you're not thinking through those things quite as much. You get caught up in the social aspect, you're having good conversation, and then when something does take place that you weren't planning on happening, then I think a lot of times that's how people find themselves in troubles, because they didn't talk about, okay, if something happens, who's going to be the leader of this? And if that person is the leader and they're the ones that get hurt, then how does the rest of the group manage this? Or like all of those aspects. And I don't think that that's a common conversation that a lot of people have when they're going out backpacking or doing things in the backcountry with a group of friends.
No, I don't think it is either. I've traveled with people that when I start bringing up things when we get to camp about bear safety, or, I wouldn't put your tree there because that's a widowmaker. I wouldn't put your tent there because that's a widowmaker. You know what a widowmaker will do. It's really good to have clear communication with your group and for everybody to understand, what it takes if we have something go wrong and who's doing what. And I think a lot of people just throw it in the car and go. I call that euphoria you were just describing about being on the trip and everybody's conversing and having a great time. And it's a beautiful place and all our emotions get wrapped up in it. And we just, we're just in love. And it's why we do what we do, because we love being out there. And, I've always said this: ignorance is bliss. And,
right.
And bliss kills.
Yes.
And so that's kind of how I look at it, is, it's okay to be caught up in the moment and feel the euphoria of a backcountry adventure, because it is euphoric. It's amazing. It's part of our spirit. And we find it's what we're all connected to, because it's like going home. But it's still that mindset. You have to come back to reality that you still have to deal with things. And, it's nice to feel the freedom that the backcountry provides our spirit, but at the same time, there's a sense of responsibility that we need to carry, because, people's lives can be at stake, and nobody wants to see anybody, have that kind of a tragedy out there. So.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think is important is because we're very much focused on this conversation of risk management right now. But if you do your homework and you do all of this planning ahead of time, you know exactly what you want to do, the kind of decisions you want to make. This doesn't have to deter from your ability to have an amazing experience, awesome social experiences and conversations, and for that to be just something that's in the back of your head. It's better to have that there. That's the whole point of us having this conversation, that you have these plans, you have these decisions that you've made beforehand, and you understand those risks, but they don't have to be, well, now that I know all of these things that I've made this plan, now I can't have a good time in the backcountry.
Yeah, no, and definitely don't want this conversation to make people go, oh, geez, maybe I shouldn't go, or maybe this is just too dangerous or whatever. I really feel like this conversation is more of a spreading an awareness.
Yes.
That, these are the variables that you can face while you're out there, and the better prepared for the variables that you are, the better you are in a situation to manage that risk when it occurs. I'll give you an example of what I'll do when I'm out back on the split board and I'm backcountry touring and doing avalanche testing. And I have an older beacon that I'll take with me in the pack, and I'll bury my pack with that older beacon in it. And then I'll have my shovel and probe not deployed. So I have to deploy them. And I'll walk 30 yards from where I just buried my pack. And then I'll spin myself in circles like 10 to 15 times very rapidly to almost to the point where you're dizzy. And what that does is that simulates that panic response that, oh my God, my friend just got buried by an avalanche. I got to dig him out. So that adrenaline that you experience from that accident occurring when you see someone get taken down by a slide, it simulates that, and it makes me have to work twice as hard to go and, do a core search, find search with the beacon, and then, probe the pack and then actually unbury it. And it simulates that panicked response that we get when an accident does occur. And the better you can manage that panic, the better the outcome of that accident is going to be. Because panic will cause people to do like things that you can know someone for 30 years and they get in a panic and you're just looking at them going, why is he doing that? Like because it's the behavior that comes out. It's an emotional strain out of human behavior. It's not, something that you experience every day. So.
Yeah, and I love those kinds of scenarios. And that's one of my favorite things about the wilderness first responder training that I have. And my good friend, he and I have done all of that training together, and we're known to go on trips together, and we'll run scenarios on each other.
That's brilliant.
In the backcountry, because you're out there doing things that would warrant having to do those kinds of skills as a woofer. And so it's all training. It's all part of just the experience, really.
Well, and I think a lot of people too go, they go buy these like fancy first aid kits and stuff like that have all these tools and stuff in them. So that gives them this false sense of confidence. And you have to really sit down and ask yourself, what is my actual medical training? Now, you having a woofer, you're probably better off than 90% of most of the people that backcountry travel, because you've been trained through a class on how to, triage a victim. And, and I always tell people, like, make sure you carry a first aid kit that you can actually use. So you've got this big complicated thing with all these like options in it, but you don't know how to use any of it.
Yeah.
What good are you to the patient that you're trying to help? And so I try to keep mine within the realm of what I feel like my medical experience is and what I feel comfortable treating. And I try not to go beyond that, because you can actually hurt someone worse if you don't know what you're doing. And so I think that's just a really healthy thing to keep inside of our heads, is stay within what you're comfortable with and don't let the ego get in the way. And there's never any shame for asking for help when you need it. If you feel like you're in over your head, go get that help, because you're going to help that person much better by bringing a more experienced individual in that can actually provide them the assistance they need.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I've got one more question that I think is an important question to ask before we talk about this accident that took place, this story for you to share, because I think it's really important to hear stories of firsthand experiences of things that have happened in the backcountry. So I'm very excited to, in a very respectful way, talk about what took place. But the question for you before we jump into that is, from your perspective, how do different seasons present room for error and risk?
Oh gosh, that's a great one. And the different seasons bring the different variables. So I think you just have to be aware of, what each season brings, and it brings its own inherent risk. I mean, if you're in the summertime, unless you've like gotten wet and you have one of those freak August snowstorms, hypothermia is not top of the list. Where, if it's wintertime and you're, going through the Paria down in, Escalante, and there's ice and it's freezing overnight, and those slot canyons don't get any sunlight most of the time. And, then hypothermia is a huge reserve. And so, it's really just understanding, once again, weather, terrain, and managing and mitigating all of that for the time of year that you're out there.
And I feel like very often, and the fortunate thing is, with, as far as backpacking is concerned, the most common time to go out for the vast majority of weekend warrior type of backpackers that are only going out 1 or 2 times a year ever is to go out in the summer. And there is way more room for error in that.
Absolutely.
In that season, because you're just not dealing with is extreme temperature swings. Your weather is more predictable, and it's just, you don't have as many things that you have to be concerned about as you do when you're in the middle of or early spring or fall to late fall, and then winter is a whole other beast. But
Absolutely.
I think it's important for us to recognize, as well as help educate others, that you're probably very often in the summer just getting lucky with your ignorance, which isn't a bad thing. Like, people should be able to go out into the backcountry. And I mean, my first few backpacking trips, I didn't know obviously what I know now, and that shouldn't be a reason for me to not go enjoy myself on a backpacking trip.
Absolutely. No. And, people obviously, most of the time misconstrue the word ignorance. They take it as an insult. And I base ignorance off the base definition in the dictionary, and it's a lack of knowledge, lack of knowing.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make you stupid or dumb or an insult or whatever ad hominem thing anybody wants to try to attach to that. And I know some people do use that as an insult, and it's awful because it's a horrible use of the word. Ignorance means you just don't know. And the thing that's awesome about human beings is and this goes hand in hand in this discussion we're having, is that when you do have something tragic happen to you, it's an opportunity for learning. And that's how human beings learn. We learn from our mistakes. We don't learn anything from getting it right all the time. That's just dumb luck.
Right.
Nobody gets it right all the time. And so I think it's just really important that we learn from the mistakes and understand those things and be okay with a little ignorance. I don't know everything. I'm not a rock climber. I don't know if you are, but I know the basic gear because I used to work in a gear shop and sold that stuff. But I don't participate in the activity regularly. So it's, there's probably newer advances in technology and gear that I don't know. And I'm ignorant to that. And that doesn't make me, insulted to admit that. That's just the facts because of the basic definition of the word ignorance. And I think that when we take things into context and apply them properly, I think it brings a greater definition to things that we can apply to our personal situation, which will just make us stronger when we're out there.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about this because you and I discussed this a little bit before we started recording this, but the aspect of shaming after something takes place. And we'll talk about that. We don't need to answer that right now, but I want to get into this experience that you had that illustrates the discussion that we've had for the last several 45 minutes, and talk about what took place, what were the conditions like, and ultimately how you made decisions to help your friend and what the result was, just how this experience was for you.
Absolutely. This is actually one of the most terrifying experiences I ever had backpacking. First time in 20 years backpacking, I've had to get rescue for someone in my party. Me and my friend that was in the accident who obtained the injury had been traveling in the UNS all summer together. Much bigger adventures than this. Trust me, this incident was the end of September last year. We were just looking to get out, do a short 2-mile hike, set up camp, do some fly fishing, get a good night's sleep in the woods, wake up, have breakfast, coffee, nice little hike out. This was one of those end of September, seasons winding down. Just wanted to squeeze in an overnighter. Nobody was thinking we were trying to do the Highline Trail or anything big. This was just we both had Saturday and Sunday off. Let's go. Right. You're not thinking, oh, this is some, massive adventure, and that, any sort of accident happening in this realm was the farthest thing from either of our minds, especially with all the places we had been over the summertime and all the big, huge hikes we had done. 7 miles, 2,000 feet of elevation gain one way on some of them. And, so some of those were like, you felt like a human yo-yo by the time you got to camp because you're just up and down. This one was not anywhere near. There's a nice little 2-mile hike through the woods to a little lake. That's a great little campsite, great fishing. It's great for photography. It was just nice to get out. And that's all our goal was on this trip. we had a great day and evening. I got fish. We got camp set up. We were able to harvest all of our firewood. I mean, we were so prepared for the temps that were coming that night, because the daytime was in about the upper 40s the day we hiked in, and the overnight was expected to go about 24. And we all had gear to be prepared for that. So, that it was going to be just fine. We're going to have a nice fire. There was nothing to even indicate that we were going to get into what eventually ended up happening. Around 10 o'clock, we had like a cloud bank, because that day that it was like the first snowfall in the Uintas for the year, a couple days prior to when we had gone out there, and it was the first really cold temperatures out there for the season too. And so there had been these cloud banks going over, and I was able to shoot some time lapse of it earlier in the day, and just like beautiful. And finally started getting the clouds. At night at the Uintas, they'll clear out and you get those crystal clear skies. So I hiked around the north end of the lake to shoot the Milky Way and do some photography. And I got back to camp from doing that around like 10:30 p.m. And my partner was sitting by the fire. He had been kind of keeping things rolling in that area. And I set up my camera out on the shore to shoot a star trail. I come back into camp to get some gloves, because it was obviously colder. And I just had these little like liners on when I went to shoot, and my fingers were freezing. And so I had these like thicker fleece ones I went to get out of my tent. And just as I literally had zipped the door open, I heard crunch, and then my partner's taking a fall and he's moaning in agony. And of course, the first thing that goes through your head is, oh my God, what's going on? And just kind of, like I said, there's something about when you get in these like serious situations that just makes me go into work mode. And I was just like, first thing I got to do is find out how hurt he is. And he was telling me it was his right ankle. He couldn't move it. He was painful. He was in a lot of pain. So I had him put his legs straight out and to try to line up the feet. And the left foot, if you put your feet out in front of you without like letting them flop to the sides, they'll both stand vertically in the air. Well, the left one was vertically in the air. The right one was laying on its side with his legs straight forward.
Oh my gosh.
So I immediately knew he had a fracture. I knew it. I was just like, oh, yep, that's not good. And I started contemplating, okay, what am I going to do here? And I knew I had to go get help, because he couldn't walk out. And we're dealing with, sub-freezing temperatures, risk of hypothermia, risk of shock. He's not doing well. He's starting to get disoriented. Speech was getting a little colluded. And I had, earlier in the day when I'd been walking around the lake fly fishing, there were some campers that were on the other side of the lake from us. And I just was like, I got to go get their help, because in my mind, I'm thinking if they can stay with Jared, I can go out and get help and get search and rescue back in here. And so I went over to them. They were very nice guys. They came over right away. And I just like literally had told them, hey, can you stay here with my bro? I'll go get help. I'll come back. And this was kind of like a father-son sort of trip, like the father and his son and the son's friends. Okay. Were out on a backpacking trip. And the guy's name was Phil. And like I said, if he ever listens to this or I ever get a chance to see him, the eternal gratitude for this guy. I think you can tell, because this person that got injured was a very dear friend of mine that I have known. I've traveled all over the wilderness of North America with this person. And I think you could tell I was severely stressed out for my friend. And he just looked at me and he grabbed me by the shoulder. He says, you're going to stay here and keep your friend stable. I'm going to take my son and we're going to go get help. And I think in the heat of the moment, I just was just like, yes, sir. Because you want resolution to the situation. And
right.
And I just said, yes, sir. And so, him and his son went and got their day packs and headlamps, and they scooted off out the trail. And I knew he was going to get hypothermic if I didn't get him warm. So I tried to get him to let me carry him to his tent. We tried it. He had no way. He was in so much pain. And so I got his sleeping pad out and I inflated it. And then we got him on top of that. And then we put 3 sleeping bags on top of him. And then I had a bunch of hand warmers and foot warmers in my pack, because at that time of year, I keep that kind of stuff in there because you just never know. And so we got the hand warmers and foot warmers inside the bag. And then what we did is we put rocks around the fire pit, raised the fire big, and then put those hot rocks in kind of almost an oval around his body to create a windbreak. So we had probably like a 5-mile-an-hour wind that was going on in there. And if you're below freezing, you can imagine the wind chill that comes along with that too. And it basically became like a waiting game. And the longer it went on, the more terrified I got, because, the temperature keeps plummeting. And my friend's becoming less and less responsive, and I'm keeping like going, hey man, talk to me. And, just trying to keep him cognitive and aware. And finally around like 2:00 in the morning, I see a helicopter coming over the lake. And I don't know if you've ever seen those Lucy lamps, or little inflatable solar lamps. So I'm out there with two of those blinking, and then my headlamp blinking, flagging the helicopter down. And then about 30 minutes later, Summit County Search and Rescue ground team came in. And what was nice about it is, and this made me feel good, and when they finally got to him and got him an IV drip and were able to give him meds, that was the one thing I didn't do too, is that I know for a fact that they're going to ask what meds have you taken before they administer any medicine to you, because it's a liability thing for them. So so those guys over there had some like Lortabs or whatever from the camp. I called for help, and I wouldn't let him take them because I wanted him to be able to get him into an IV drip right away. And the search and rescue told me, you did the right thing on that, because now we can administer him medicine. So, and when they got him hooked up to the IV and were able to get him some medicine, they took all his vitals, and his vitals were normal. Wow. And that's right there. And then I'm not going to lie, I have no ego over it. I was shedding a few tears and was crying, because I was just, some of it was, trauma, and some of it was joy that my friend was going to be okay. And they put life flight into the meadow right above our camp, and they hauled him out of there by life flight. And search and rescue was kind, and those guys in Summit County, got hats off to them. They're amazing individuals. They helped my friend Sherry, who had had a rock climbing accident on Hayden Peak earlier in the summer. And those guys are just outstanding individuals and deserve all my respect that I can give them. And they asked me if I wanted, they would, we only have to walk a quarter mile, and they had brought an ATV up the trail. I could throw my pack on and hike out. And I just didn't feel right. I just wanted to kind of decompress, and so I just told him I would go ahead and hike out in the morning. And I had my vehicle there anyways. What I was going to do, go sleep in my car for the night. I just
right.
Didn't. I already had my tent up. I had all my survival gear. I had a raging fire going. There was no reason to leave. And I probably got like maybe 4 hours of sleep. I was awoken about 7:00 in the morning by a pack of coyotes howling over the top of the camp. And at that point, my brain was just still swimming from what had happened and what was going on. So I just did this mad dash pack at 8:00 in the morning, was on trail by 9, and back into the city before 11. And, the great joy in all this, because this person's like one of my best friends, he has since recovered from his injury. He had a fib, tib, and ankle fracture. And he had to have, hardware put in, and went through physical therapy and all the inconveniences of an injury that does that to a human being. But I'm proud to say he was just over at my house last week here, and walking on both feet, and he's ready to go. He wants to start building himself back up so we can get back out on trail. So happy ending to a tragic story. But
yeah, that is.
Just goes to show you that we had all of our ducks in a row. Both of us had all the gear we needed. We had all the, great spot. We had water, we had shelter, we had fire. We had all the things that precipitate survival. And then this just weird thing what he had done, and I didn't see it. I was able to talk to him after the fact, because I didn't know what he was doing. All I know is I was getting in my tent. All of a sudden I hear this loud whack. And then he's over there moaning in agony. And what he had done is he had gone to step over a log. How it's common in the UN is they'll stack logs around a fire pit for people to sit on them. Yes. So he had stepped over one of those logs, but the shadow from the fire was dropping, and there was another log on the other side he didn't see. So his foot rolled backwards as his body went forward, and that's what caused the fracture.
Wow, that's crazy.
So, just freak accident, man. I mean, literally, we were just talking 5 minutes before that. Nothing wrong. Both having a great evening, enjoying this. I'm just letting my camera run. We're enjoying the flicker of the flame, and just enjoying the beautiful place we were in. And then it just went from like beautiful to tragic, just like that. Just unbelievable how fast all of that changed. So
we don't need to spend a lot of time on this. And I'm just honestly really glad that everything for that whole situation worked out the way that it did, because it's important that he's able to continue to feel like, okay, now I can recover from this, and everything was fine. Like, it was a crappy situation, but my friend took care of me and got me out of there. And now I can go and enjoy more time in the backcountry. and I don't know exactly where I was going with that, but
Oh, you're fine, man.
yeah, but I guess the follow-up question is, were there decisions that you made prior to this particular event? Because this is a freak accident, something you obviously didn't say like, well, cool. Yeah, we're going to have a tip fib and search and rescue come and get my friend out. But what decisions, like when you went back and analyzed the trip planning and everything, were there things that you decided ahead of time that helped manage that situation better while you were in it?
Yeah, it goes right back to that the weather report that I told you that's the first thing that I look at before I even pack the bag. Because I knew what the temperature spread was going to be from certain hours. This device, and I'll send you this link, Devin, and you can share it with folks on their site. It's not, anything you need to hide or secrets. It's an hourly tablature that the National Weather Service puts in to the NOAA website that you can pull up as another link when you're doing a pinpoint forecast. And it shows you the hour by hour of what they're expecting in humidity, wind, temperature, moisture, lightning. And I knew from that 10:30 hour to 2:00 in the morning, it was going to do a 30 to 22 degree swing. And then at 4 a.m., it was going to dip to 21, and then it was going to come back to 30 drastically right at sunrise. So there was just this period of where there was a little cold front that was going to brush, just kind of tickle the area. And had we not had all that warm gear with us, and I would have just gone in with my ultralight and tried to tough it out, we would probably had a different situation. But because we had all of that warm stuff and extra sleeping bags and extra layers and sleeping bag liners and, brought the warm pads. I almost brought my UL pad I do in the summer, but I brought my warm pad. And same with my bro. He brought his warm pad instead of his ultralight one. So I think a lot of just the gear preparation and the weather forecasting really honestly was probably one of the biggest things that helped us out. And, little guardian angel from Phil and his crew across the lake, because the scenario you're facing with that, what I was facing, and had they not been there, I've been by myself. So you've got my partner that's hurt, laying there hurt, and then I go to hike out, and then I slip and fall. So then we got 2 injuries. Then what happens?
Yeah.
And, that's what the biggest thing I've learned from this, and I won't travel in the backcountry without it now, is a PLB. You've got to have a personal locator beacon. It's just so super important. If we had that at camp, we'd have had him out of there by midnight. That's what took so long to get search and rescue, because you had to have someone hike out. They had gotten to, where the Crystal Lake campground is, right?
Yes.
So they had gone to the camp host there, and that camp host had a spot GPS. And so they initiated the rescue there, but of course there's no phone to talk to anybody because camp host didn't have a satellite phone. They just had the spot GPS. And so they had to wait for search and rescue to get to the camp host and then tell them, oh, no, the rescue's not here. The rescue is over here. We hiked to here to get this initiated. And so it added time to the situation. And had it been compounded or he was bleeding out, that could have been a much worse situation for us to deal with. So now I'm just rule of thumb. I'm always going to have one with me. And, it will bring a little more peace of mind when I'm solo, too. If I have another accident like I had in Cooper and I couldn't walk out, I'd just be able to initiate that button and just sit tight. It's on its way.
Right.
So
right.
I think that's probably the biggest thing I learned about this. 2 things. One thing, re-solidified a thought I've always had in my head that you can do everything right and it will still all go wrong. Yep. That this trip just definitely re-solidified that in my head. And then I'm not carrying a PLB and I need to start. And so if there were any educational value for the trip, those were the 2 biggest things that I came away from that with. And a sense of being grateful and no matter, where we stand in life or the things we view or the things that, are personal to us or whatever, that there was just a group of human beings that got together that night and took care of somebody that needed help. And I find that to have the greatest value out of that situation of all, is to see the human element come forward and overcome a tragedy like this, because this could have been much worse. And all the search and rescue guys were telling me that, too, that I did everything right because hypothermia sets in so fast, and especially with a fracture like that. It's, you've got other stuff going on with like adrenaline and cortisol and things like that racing through the human body that just exasperate that condition.
Well, and you touched on this, and this wasn't necessarily something that I planned to talk about, but we're so deep into this conversation. And
yeah,
at this point, man. I don't really care how long this episode goes because this is such an important conversation but what you touched on is really like kind of the core beginning of any kind of incident that you are responding to as a woofer, as a wilderness first responder. Your scene size up with your friend was just really well executed. First and foremost, I'm number one, and you're taking care of yourself, making sure that you're not putting yourself as an additional patient, which is very important. And then like what happened to you is step two. So you're making sure that you're checking to see exactly what took place and what happened to that person.
Yeah.
And then there's other things in that scene size up, as far as like making sure you're not getting contaminants and stuff from somebody that may be bleeding a lot and other things. And then you're checking for other patients, but then spending the rest of that time with the patient, considering, okay, what happened to him, but now what's the like overall impression of their like seriousness of their condition. And it's cool to hear that, having the woofer training that I have over the past 4 years, and then to hear somebody that has not gone through a woofer training execute a scene size up like that so well in that kind of scenario.
Yeah, so, I've traveled the backcountry with several people that have woofers, and we've had these, sit around the campfire, having a beverage conversations about, this scenario. What do you do in this scenario? And and then there's obviously a lot of literature out there that, help you assess a patient when you're dealing with a patient. I'm fortunate enough that my wife's cousin is a doctor that actually came to Utah and got his woofer because he wanted to have a woofer so he could take his medical, because he's an actual licensed MD. And he wanted to be able to utilize his MD skills in the backcountry because he does travel in the backcountry. And, I think you learn from some people, experience dictates some stuff. And I think when you bring it all together, and then, you utilize it and implement it, then I think that's where you get your greatest outcome. And I'm lucky, and then some people have to like rev themselves up to get into that work mode in a panic situation.
Yes.
I think, and I've suffered from mild anxiety and PTSD most of my life. And so I think it's a coping mechanism for me in any time I have anxiety or PTSD, is to just go into work mode, because it moves you through the episode you're having with that anxiety or PTSD. And so, by accident, I think I've been fortunate to have a reaction in those situations that's not off the bore or making all the bad decisions because you're not thinking clearly and stopping to just, hey, let's put together a process. What do we need to do? Where are we at? What do we need to do to get from point A to point B? And I feel fortunate for that. And, we have this discussion about all of this stuff. And, I definitely don't want the listener to think that, I think I know it all, because I certainly don't. You have, a far more extensive education in this than I do. This is just how I approach it by those that have that same education that you do, and what they would do in those situations. And I've just taken that knowledge and basically, paid it forward. That's just kind of how I look at this is, and it's something that everybody should have in the back of their mind if they're going to travel in a wilderness area. It is inherently dangerous. It always will be. That will never change. That's the one factor in all this that you don't ever have to worry about changing, is that wilderness will always be dangerous. So, and you can count on that. And so the better prepared you are for that, and the cooler head that you keep, if you do have an accident come up, the better the outcome is going to be. And I think our outcome that we got from this situation definitely reflects that 100%. So
I would agree. Well, the last thing that I want to talk about that we touched on earlier is this aspect of shaming. And
yes.
Just to wrap up the conversation, we've talked about all of these things. We've talked about ignorance, risk management, and how do we ultimately, if you've got the person that is new to backpacking or wilderness travel, backcountry travel, that doesn't know all of these education points, and then you've got somebody that may have something happen to them. How do we, as people that enjoy and are passionate about the backcountry, ensure that we keep it an inclusive space for everybody, regardless of the decisions that are made, regardless of the accidents that take place, regardless of who that person is? How do we keep that inclusive and not shame, and just make it inviting for everybody to be able to participate in?
That's a great question. And, I don't know if I have all the answers for it, but I'll answer it the best way that I can. When I first started splitboarding, I was a really avid snowboarder. I was a local there for a decade. And when I first started getting into the backcountry, you'd hear about these avalanche accidents where someone would die, and it was a considerable day in the forecast, and everybody knew there was a persistent weak layer, and you had all this stuff that was just knowledge that was out there before, and it always struck you in your head at first, why was that person stupid to go out on a day like this? But then you reel it back in, and I was fortunate enough to have a conversation with a guy named Bruce Tremper, who used to run the Utah Avalanche Center, and we were talking about why do people make these decisions, and it's always about a decision thing when it comes to this area of recreation. And he was like, for the longest time, I used to get mad when people make decisions like that. Then I realized, if I shame this individual, they're less likely to share their experience with me. So then we're less likely to hear about an avalanche in the backcountry that we can go investigate the crown and the bed surface of. And we're less likely to hear the decisions that they made that got them in the situation where the actual accident occurred. And it takes away a huge learning tool in the backcountry when we shame victims. I am not in the camp of shaming anybody for having an accident in the wilderness, because you know what? I just know it. Crap happens in the world. It just does. And,
yeah.
You can have the most beautiful day, and all of a sudden a tree falls over on you. You can be the safest person in the world too, and walk out to the curb to get the mail and get ran over by the milk truck. I mean, it's how the world works. And I think for those folks that are less experienced, that those of us that are more experienced, it's our job to share with them the things that we have learned and educate them about this. And if you're in this scenario, this is a good idea to look at it this way. And like I said, I don't know everything. I don't know it all. And I'm actually glad I don't, because I think I'd be insane if I did. But, that's how I've always approached it with newer backpackers that come out with me, and the stuff that I've learned. And I show them, here's a good place for tent site selection. And, here's the kind of wood you gather. You don't touch anything green. It's always ground harvest. And, just those little things that we, not even just safety things, just little things that we teach new backpackers on trail. I think it's easily, we're easily able to incorporate that education of safety and risk management and stuff into all of that. And I think you'll have a whole bunch of better prepared backpackers out there if they're learning this stuff. And, there's a lot of literature out there that you can recommend to people that they should go read that will definitely help their backpacking. And then just essential practice, take the tent out at home, go set up a camp in your backyard and simulate an emergency. See how you respond, see what your timing is to that response, and see how comfortable you feel. You might find yourself in a situation like I found it. Very similar to you, we have done simulations in the backcountry where pretending someone had a broken leg and what would you do and stuff like that. I think a lot of that really helped my response on an actual real accident where someone could have lost their life. And I think it's really important to play through those scenarios. Put some lunch money on it. Who buys the beers after you get out to the trailhead? Whatever. It's never a bad idea to practice, because and it's something you hammer home in avalanche safety is practice, 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 because practice makes perfect. Because if you don't get it perfect in 15 minutes, you're going to have a terrible outcome. And because that's the average time someone stays alive in a burial is 15 minutes. So, and I thought it was cool when I heard you say that to me is, we used to go out and practice these scenarios. I'm like, that's just awesome. Because that's what it takes with this. It really does. And, that you always hear that old saying, walk in the park. Well, no, the wilderness is not that. And, we need to treat it with a healthy dose of respect. And those of us that we invite to travel with us that may have less experience or less time in the woods than us, we should share our education with them. And I think education is probably the absolute, number one thing I would recommend for anybody in this is get educated. Take a class. If you've got time and the time and the money to do a woofer, take it. Not going to hurt you. It'll only help you.
Yeah. Education is so
it's critical. It's so important. Wow.
Absolutely, man.
What a cool conversation. And we talked on and touched on topics that we didn't really plan for, planning this episode ahead of time. But Christian, I am just so grateful for the time that you've taken today to share your experiences, to share your education, your years of just time in the backcountry. And yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. That's been awesome.
No, man, thanks for having me. And, this is just, part of the therapy from the trauma from this event that I described in this podcast is, it's how I feel like I can pay it forward, is how do I share this experience best that it serves people the best. And I think when you suggested doing this, I was so on board, because I'm just like, great, I've been looking for an outlet. How do I share this with the public so they can get an idea of, this is what we went through and this is how we managed things and this is the outcome we had. And this has been awesome, man. It's been awesome to dig into all this stuff. And it, just makes you realize like how lucky we all are every single day.
I don't even know how to follow up with that, but
well, I'm sure you know from, your experience that you had in Capitol Reef recently. I'm sure a lot of your woofer training came into play, and think about if you had not had that training, what would the outcome might have been? It might have been different. So, that's where just education is so important, and it helped you make a really good decision. And here we are sitting and have a podcast instead of a tragedy to talk about. So that's awesome, man.
Yeah. And that's what I've enjoyed so much about that particular experience is it was the driving force to sit here and record and have this discussion today. So again, just want to say thank you to you and hope you have an awesome day. Hope you have an awesome day, man.
Awesome. You too, man. And thanks for having me on. And we'll talk to you soon.
So a huge thank you to Christian for taking so much time out of his day to have this conversation about risk management with me. And I hope that you found some value and maybe some education and some things that you may have not known beforehand about risk management that can help you know how to make smarter decisions in the backcountry. So some of the key takeaways that I want to just reiterate in ending this episode, finishing things up here. And so what I want to say is experience in the field is something that will always develop more confidence for future trips in the field that allow you to make better risk management plans based on that experience. The more time you spend in the backcountry, the more educated you're going to become, the more understanding you're going to have of different situations that will be posed because of going out in different seasons, whatever it is. The more experience, the more confidence that you can gain in making smarter decisions because you're now educated and have a better understanding of those situations. So smart decisions in the backcountry begin long before you ever pack your pack and step foot on the trail. A risk management plan is well executed, it's thought out, and checks all of the necessary boxes that keep you and everyone safe. And if for some reason something is out of your control or an accident does happen, you can have more confidence or you've got more confidence to know how to handle the situation that you've been posed with. Also know how the different seasons pose different risks. And also, I think ultimately the biggest thing about this is the experience that you want to have in the backcountry really is dictated based off of the decisions that you make ultimately before you even go out on the trip, but also while you are out there. And if you need to go back and rewind and re-listen to the conversation that Christian and I had and the questions that were asked and discussed, write those things down, understand them, and then do your own research on risk management and know how you can just have more enjoyable, more successful backpacking trips by following good risk management and decision-making processes when you're in the backcountry. To go back to the story of me in Capitol Reef National Park, to sum that up, that particular trip was something that taught me a lot about how to make good decisions in the backcountry. I was solo, and it had been a long time since I had been on a solo backpacking trip. And it was so important for me to be cognitive and mindful of what was taking place, to take mental notes, and to just know that, okay, this event happened. I bashed my knee on the rock, and that knowledge compounded with all of the other decisions that I had to make, those check boxes of, okay, now there's a cloud that has moved in that is giving me very little visibility. There's a lot of ice down here, more than I anticipated. And even with microspikes, I potentially would pose and put myself into a position that could be very dangerous. And it was in my best interest to skip going into what could have been one of the most beautiful settings in the winter that I've ever had the opportunity to be in, and to bypass that so that I made smart decisions that allowed me to get home to my family ultimately. And there's a lot to learn from knowing how other people make decisions in the backcountry and how that can affect you and the decisions that you make when you are out on your personal trips. So I'm going to wrap that thought process up right there and let you just kind of go with it, but it's such an important discussion, and I know that this was a very long episode, but very, very important information that was discussed in this episode. So I really appreciate you watching, being part of this episode about making smart decisions in the backcountry. I would love your feedback and comments and anything that you want to tell me about things that you learned from this episode. And a huge thank you again to Christian for sharing his experience and his story specifically from last year. Just an amazing, amazing guy that has a lot to share, and hopefully we can get him on the podcast to share more cool stories from his experiences in the backcountry later. So with that, guys, I just want to say thank you again for listening today and checking out this episode about making smart decisions in the backcountry. Really appreciate you guys being part of this, and would love your feedback or any comments that you have. Leave your reviews, rate, and subscribe. Follow the podcast on whatever podcast service you listen on. And again, check out the video that I have about this Capitol Reef National Park backpacking trip that I went on in the link that's in the show notes. You guys, yes, thank you for listening today to the backpacking experience. I hope you have an awesome week. We'll catch you on the next episode.